I would like to take you on a journey about new options of financing in the agriculture sector. Actually, as the company name says, Soil and More, my heart, as Stephen's heart, beats for soil and compost. I'll also talk a little bit about it, but actually Stephen spoke or talked about most of the issues I wanted to talk as well related to compost, so I really can focus on the carbon side of life. Good. What has climate change, carbon, global warming to do with farming? I guess if you would ask people on the street if they know about climate change, if they know about global warming, some of them would say yes or no. But the ones who would say yes, maybe spontaneously would say this is due to transportation, due to energy, due to waste maybe, airplanes, etc. But actually, if you look to the split of greenhouse gas emissions on a global level, you see that directly and indirectly from agriculture there is about 30% of all global greenhouse gas emissions coming from agriculture, and then depending on where you set the assessment boundaries, there could be another 10 to 15% related to transport of food. So you could say between 30 and 45% greenhouse gas emissions originate through agricultural or food related practices. So it is significant. It's almost half of the global greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture and food related activities. Now there is different sources in agriculture for greenhouse gas emissions, but the most critical part is actually something you just heard. We heard from Stephen a few things to remember. One thing I always remember is this thin layer we have on planet Earth, which is the topsoil. The first, depending on where you are, 10, 20, 30, 50 centimeters. So he spoke about that in this topsoil layer there is actually most of the planetary life. Yeah? But it's not only the life, it's also, if you look at it, there is 50% of the entire global carbon. When we talk about climate change and global warming and how to prevent it, we talk about planting trees and not cut down the rainforest, which is all true, very important. But this actually, the above ground biomass, this is how you call grassland, trees, etc., only represents 20% of the global carbon. There is another 30% in rocks like mineral carbon, but then the remaining 50% of the global carbon is in this topsoil, which is where we farm, where we grow our food. So the way how we manage it, whether we keep this carbon or we maybe even further increase the carbon or we release it through non-sustainable farming practices, this really makes a difference, and this really will decide about the future of planet Earth. Because if greenhouse gas emissions increase, obviously topsoil is gone, meaning no food, no air to breathe, end of humanity. Now, this maybe sounds all very theoretic, but what does it actually mean if we don't take care about our soil, our topsoil? This is James. He grows coffee in Kenya. He showed me a picture, we work a lot in Kenya, he showed me a picture of 5-6 years ago of his coffee bush. You see a lot of coffee cherries. But now, the same type of bush with much less production. What happened? Soil erosion, landslides, loss of topsoil, loss of production. So it's really not a nice to have, like something, okay, let's produce coffee, but also do a little bit for soil conservation. It is key. No soil, no food. In case you are a farmer, no money, no job. Yeah, it is critical. Now back to a global level. This is what we see all over the place. It's happening in Egypt, in Africa, Asia, even in Germany. Last year, actually 2 years ago, we had a huge car accident in Germany with 50, 60 dead, because the highway, and you know in Germany you can drive very fast, the highway went through an agricultural area with big fields where people didn't grow or didn't farm in a sustainable way, so there was a lot of erosion. It was a windy day, so half of the soil was blown into the air. The drivers didn't see anything, crashed into each other, 60 dead people. So it's not only something somewhere, but it's really happening everywhere. And it also means not only loss of soil, but as we learned, in this topsoil layer you have nitrogen, you have carbons. The moment this topsoil is eroded, a lot of CO2, greenhouse gases, goes to the air. So that's source number one. If you don't farm agriculture properly, if you don't take care about the soil properly, a lot of CO2 emissions occur. Another scenario, which we already heard of, is that on a global scale, we have an enormous amount of unused biomass. You know all this, yeah? I just want to give you two kind of, or actually three kind of funny examples. On the top left side, this is Egypt. I don't know who of you know Egypt from a map. It's basically desert. Yeah, there's 2% of the surface is arable. The rest of the country is pure desert. Now, Egypt produces a lot of rice, funny enough. Not as much as you do, but they produce a lot, which results in 23 million tons of rice straw every year. Now, in a country where you only have 2% arable area, you would consider to maybe bring this rice straw back to the soil. But what they do, they burn it. Yeah, which is not only bad for the soil equation, but it's also bad for health because everybody gets asthmatic diseases. On the right-hand side, this is Cape Town. We heard about a project of Stephen in Australia working with municipalities. Together with a local partner 5 years ago, we set up a composting site in Cape Town, which handles almost 100% of the green waste from Cape Town, which is about 800 tons per day. So it's collected there, it's composted, and brought back to the fields. What happened before is that these 800 tons per day were put on a landfill. Big piles, lots of money, and lots of methane coming out. Because what happens if you have a huge pile of wet material, it starts to break down anaerobically, and what smells is the methane. It even hurts your nose, like if you smell in fresh chicken manure. So Cape Town, you know, for 5 years ago, the World Championship was there. Luckily this time we won. Last time it was in Cape Town. To prepare the city and make it green, they dumped all this green waste on a landfill, but bought compost from France, which is 10,000 kilometers away, because they didn't realize that what they call waste is actually a resource. Last example, Mexico, avocado area, very intense farming, lots of chemicals. It's grown on volcanic soil, so very young soils, very rough structure, lots of leakage. So most of the fertilizers actually leach out to the rivers, lakes, and canals. Then, as a reaction of nature, lots of water, hyacinths, water lilies moved in to suck up all this pollutants. But then there was more water hyacinths than water, and then the government started to pull all this water hyacinths out of the lakes. But then, as you see, this is me standing in front of such a pile. There was no space anymore. And then the government decided to treat the water hyacinths, which were caused by chemical fertilizer, to treat those water hyacinths with herbicides in the water, which is kind of stupid, sorry. So in all scenarios we said, okay, listen, we know there's a problem, but just by dumping it or treating it somehow, it's only treating the symptoms, but we need to go back to the source, to the reason of the problem, and try to change something. So we use all these different organic materials, transform it into compost, actually exactly in the way Stephen already presented, because we went to the same school somehow. Good. Now, what are solutions for farming? I mean, I said that composting is one thing, but today we talk about climate smart agriculture. It could be actually climate-friendly agriculture, green agriculture, sustainable agriculture. It's different religions, different names, but at the end it's about optimizing farming practices by utilizing the resources in a more efficient and in a holistic way. And it's not about maximizing, but about optimizing, because if you maximize one thing, then you normally have bad side effects. Yeah? You have to consider all aspects. It's soil, it's water, it's biodiversity. We need to optimize the farming system. So I'm going to call it climate smart agriculture, but you can call it however you want. So what are the ingredients if we talk about climate smart agriculture practices which support a better or less carbon emissions? Of course, I mentioned it, agroforestry, but it's not only about planting shade trees or rainforests, because we are farmers, we still need to produce food. So it should not be a competition to either plant trees for the climate or grow food against the climate. It's a combination of things. So we need to look into agroforestry systems, looking also the impact if you grow cacao or coffee or tea or whatever. It's lots of biomass, which also fixes carbon. So it's not either or, it's inclusive. Of course, it's composting. I already talked about it. And the methane avoidance if you produce the compost in an aerobic way. Stephen already spoke a lot about composting. So I will skip part of my slides, but a few I keep, although it's a repetition, but it's so important that it's worth the repetition. Chemical fertilizer avoidance, another thing, a big source. 8% of the global greenhouse gas emissions occur due to nitrogen fertilizers, 8%. And then the major thing is actually soil carbon sequestration, which I showed you that in this topsoil we have 50% of the global carbon, and we need to take care of this. And this is what is meant by soil carbon sequestration. Now, to give you one example, which again is composting, but just briefly, you saw already some pictures. You can do it at small scale, like on the bottom side in Egypt, in India, where we work with about 4,000 small-scale tea farmers in Darjeeling. It's all done by hand. They also follow the lasagna tactic. Or you do it a little bit medium scale, like there in Mexico on the top, or then mega scale, like in South Africa, because 800 tons you cannot turn by hand. So you need sort of mechanical support. But basically, it's simple. The ingredients are normally there. If you walk around, specifically on a small-scale farm, on some mega-scale, large-scale farms, you only have soybeans or only corn, but on a normal small-scale farm, you normally have the ingredients you need. And we talk about the same thing. It's manure, nitrogen source, some green leaves, maybe half-dried, and some straw material to have the right composition. Diversity was mentioned. The next I skip, you have the printout anyway, but you see it's the same, the same ingredients. This one you also have seen, lasagna tactics. Maybe one thing on the process, as I mentioned, we work a lot with small-scale farmers in East Africa and Central America, and one of the remarks you get quite often is that composting is too labor-intensive to make it. Yeah, I mean, one aspect is always the nitrogen, the nutrient part, but then it costs too much money. You need people to make stuff, etc. It can be very labor-intensive, like any activity on this planet, if you don't think about it. Yeah. So specifically, when you look into manure, for instance, it's heavy stuff. Yeah. So if you bring it in from somewhere, you dump it somewhere, and then maybe it's in the way because actually your wife is coming home and can't drive to the garage, then you have to move it again. So think about the logistics. If you don't get the logistics right, even on small-scale composting, it's going to be very expensive. So when you get manure, try to offload it where you need it, or at least as close as possible to avoid movement. Yeah. So this is really key. It sounds very simple, but sometimes the simple things are forgotten first. Next one you already heard. Now, the topic is utilizing carbon finance. What does that mean? Some years ago, the United Nations, they realized that if we continue with business as usual, if we continue with the way we live as of today, we're going to have a problem. Because Well, Stephen mentioned that air is free, water is free, most of the natural resources are free. But actually, well, I agree, but in a world where 100 years ago we were 2 billion people, now we are 7 billion people, maybe air and water is not for free forever. Because even in this room, it's a very simple exercise. Maybe we are 50 people in here. We have a few more chairs left. But if this room would present planet Earth 100 years ago, and we would look into this room 100 years later today, there would be at least 80 people standing, which will create at a certain stage, or at the final stage, war. Yeah, because people want to sit down, the ones who sit don't want to stand up, so there's a fight for resources. And this is actually the most of the reasons for our today's war. So maybe we need less soldiers, but more soilers, maybe, to fight for soil, for the resource of soil. Anyway, the United Nations realized that today water, air, soil, etc. is kind of available for free, but actually they foresaw that in the future it might not be the case. This is why they put a cost to CO2 emissions. They said, okay, if we continue, or they said we must penalize people who emit too much CO2. And it's not only CO2, it's methane, it's nitrous oxides, it's a whole list of greenhouse gas emissions. So they said, okay, you should replace coal-fired power plants with wind parks, for instance. Or you should avoid chemical fertilizer and replace it with something else, or have less environmental harmful fertilizers. But what they also said is, if you take the biomass, which is currently piled up and decomposing, rotting away in an uncontrolled way and releasing a lot of methane, if you manage that differently through composting, where you organize it, where you avoid those methane emissions, you actually can get something which is called carbon credits. Yeah, on the left-hand scenario, the baseline, the status quo, you have a lot of CO2 emissions out of these piles, and on the right-hand side, you have less. I love compost, I love soil, and it's the best thing on planet Earth, but still, it can't do magic. Yeah, so there is no. It actually can do magic, to be honest, but there's nothing perfect. So there is still some emissions in composting. Yeah, but there is significantly less. And there is methodologies developed which can be applied on large-scale farms, but also on small-scale farms, and that's why I'm here today, to monitor environmental best practice at farming level related to composting, related to chemical fertilizer application, related to soil carbon sequestration, related to agroforestry. If you monitor this properly, you get something which is called a carbon credit. It's a certificate which says that, for instance, from July 2014 until June 2015, you avoided X amount of CO2 or nitrous oxide or methane or whatever. Now that all sounds maybe a little bit academic, and it also is, but still I try to make it a bit more practical. If you look at driving a car, and you drive 50 kilometers, you can imagine that there is some CO2 coming out because fossil fuel is used, right? Now, if you do the same thing by bicycle, if you ride the 50 kilometers by bicycle, but if you can prove that riding a bicycle, you achieve the same result, yeah, you still ride 50 kilometers, but at much lower emissions, then you get a carbon credit. It's still a little bit more complicated, but this is the underlying concept. Yeah. Now, going back to our scenario, you have the baseline, yeah, the 50 kilometers by car, or not managing biomass, lots of emissions. You have the same result. You manage these piles, but in a different way with less emissions. And for the difference, you get carbon credits, which you can sell. Because, as I mentioned, the United Nations, they decided and agreed a few years ago that there must be a cost to carbon emissions, that the people who emit too much CO2, they have to pay for that. Now they cannot reduce everything by themselves, but they can invest into projects, like in Thailand, to make sure that CO2 or methane or whatever is reduced there, because it's global warming, it's a global issue, and it doesn't matter where you reduce, but it's important that it is reduced somewhere on this planet. So companies in Germany, in the UK, in other places, they try to reduce themselves as much as possible, but then in order to achieve their targets, their emission reduction targets, they pay money to projects, for instance, in Thailand, or as we did so far in Egypt, South Africa, Mexico, Ethiopia, India, to basically make sure that low emission technologies are implemented there. And this is something we can look into here. There is already some projects happening in Thailand, in the area, not in this specific technology, but for this, I would encourage you to maybe carry out a few pilot studies to test it on certain crops, on rice, on vegetables, and other stuff with farmers, farmer groups, to see whether this is possible in Thailand as well. Good. A few examples. What we try to do is on small scale level, train farmers how to utilize waste, but actually consider it a resource, because there is no waste on a farm. Training farmer field schools, extension services. In Kenya, in East Africa, it's now about 100,000 small farmers who work with this concept. They have local farmer field schools where we set up train-the-trainer programs. So they basically took the story along. And I'll show you a very practical example on how we try to make farmers interested in utilizing climate-friendly practices. This slide you have seen is also large-scale possible, but basically what we try to do as Soil and More, as a little consulting firm, is to look for opportunities where you can treat biomass or farming systems in a different way. By doing so, reduce emissions, and then generate extra income for the farmers, because these carbon credits can be sold. And at the end, if we have some time left, I can also talk about the market, where to actually sell the carbon credits. And then this money can be used to, for instance, subsidize compost. In Egypt, we produce around, with our local partner, 60,000 tons of compost per year, which reduces or avoids about 100,000 tons of carbon. And this generates enough money to subsidize or to lower the cost of production of compost, because it's an additional revenue stream, additional income stream, by about 20–30%. So the nitrogen unit in compost in Egypt now is cheaper than the nitrogen unit in conventional fertilizers. This is why most of the buyers of compost in Egypt are now conventional people, because simply the nitrogen unit is cheaper. We learned about that it's not only about the nitrogen unit, but many people still think in nitrogen and NPK units. So it's a matter of how to market the compost. But just to show, it's not just an environmental and goodwill thing, but it also economically makes sense. And due to this, there's great things happening in Egypt. For instance, they do a reclamation of the desert, because I mentioned it's only 2% of the surface. And this is not Photoshop, this is real. I can take you there and show you. It's within a year and a half from desert to fertile soil, just utilizing waste, which is no waste. Yeah, through composting, which is managed properly, and this is about 6,000 hectares now, and growing, and more people utilize it. Now this is to make you curious and hopefully make you interested. There is, let's say, some strings attached, how to get there, which I will share with you in the next 5 minutes or so, because, bless you, because not everybody can just generate carbon credits, because, well, I could now go to a bank or to a company in Germany and say, I saved 10,000 tons of carbon in a project in China, give me money. Yeah, and then the bank says, okay, no, normally. Or they say, well, can you prove it? And if you can prove it, then you get the money. it's not as simple as that, but this is the normal logic. Now, in order that you can prove it, you have to follow a certain process. And this is one service we provide. We do mostly work related to really hands-on practical work on farm, composting, crop residue management, etc. But also, let's say, advisory to get you through this so-called emission reduction project cycle. It sounds a bit complicated. It also is complicated, but at the end, it's only cooking with water. And our intention would be to set up with you a few pilots, but then basically create here local capacity so that you can do it yourself, either within LDD or other organizations, the development bank or whoever, but help you kickstart, but then have the local capacity here to do it. It's basically, to start on the left-hand side, a certain process. So what you normally do first is a feasibility study to see, okay, rice production in the northeast, there is potential, yeah, but in the southwest, not, for instance, yeah, because the piles are not high enough or whatever. I mean, we need to assess the current scenario, because this determines how many carbon credits you will get. Yeah, if the car that drives the 50 kilometers is already very clean and green and everything, then the improvement through riding a bicycle is very limited. Yeah, so if your current farming practice is already very good, then unfortunately you get less practice. But I think, at least that's what I saw outside Thailand and most of the, or outside the countries around the table, there is still a lot of potential for good projects. So you first check what is the status quo, what is the best suitable standard and methodology to use. Then you would validate it, where you use an external auditor for, and then basically the project starts. Then the standard is set, the monitoring plan and format is agreed upon, and then you, for instance, start producing compost, or you start using less fertilizer, or you start installing an agroforestry system, and then every year or every 2 years your system is audited, and then it's determined based on a few indicators how much CO2 has been avoided. Now, since I was a farmer in Egypt, I don't like auditors because there are too many. This is why it is also our intention to try to create synergies, because I guess in Thailand there's also a lot of audits, at least if you work for exports, maybe even organic. So there is a lot of overlaps in between what a, let's say, organic certification or rainforest alliance certification or whatever certification asks for and what is needed by the carbon audits. Yeah, so if we do a pilot, I would heavily encourage you to also contact those auditing firms to see whether we can maybe create there some synergies and not just add an additional audit, which is extra time, but above all, extra money which you need to spend. On the other hand, one thing to consider is according to which standard. The overall framework is the so-called CDM. It stands for Clean Development Mechanism, which is defined by the United Nations. But then there is different markets and additional standards you can comply with, a voluntary market and then some premium market where you also look into sustainability aspects, etc., etc. So different things, we will look at what is most suitable for your circumstances. In particular, I want to highlight the so-called gold standard. It's the highest quality carbon credit because they really make sure that it's not just about reducing carbon, but that you also at the same time take care about water, about biodiversity, about yields, about social aspects. So that's something I really would encourage you to do, and they have here what you see there, a little sustainability matrix, and that's all public available on the internet to prepare yourself. But that's all indicators you would need to comply with in order to get this premium standard, but that would also allow you to sell the credits at the highest possible price. Now, having said all this, and I can tell you it is an opportunity. If you look today to the carbon markets, actually the credits or the prices for those carbon credits are quite low, but there is still opportunities to sell at high prices. But for me, and that's maybe something which which differentiates me or us as Soil and More from other carbon or emission reduction project developers. For me, the whole carbon aspect or CO2 aspect is only, let's say, the cream on top. Yeah. What really matters is that whatever practice you recommend or we recommend creates a primary benefit to the farmer, which would be less yield loss, yeah, meaning to be more adapted to a changing climate, because if you have more drought periods, heavier rainfalls, too early rainfalls, too late rainfalls, and your system is not adapted, then either you lose your crop or your soil is washed away. So it could be a benefit related to less yield loss or to higher productivity or better disease suppression. And if we make all this, and then this kind of at the side effect also generates a CO2 related benefit, then it's okay, but it should not be the way around. Yeah, that you try to maximize your system in terms of having an extra saving in CO2 and then eventually only have 1 kilo of green beans produced per hectare, yeah, which doesn't make too much sense. So first of all, best practice at farming level, smart farming, and then try to translate what you do wherever possible into a CO2 language in order to attract some additional funding there. Because it's not only about CO2. Some things I already repeated. I skipped a few slides, but this is kind of, for me, some very critical things. As I said, on a farm there is no waste. So this is a banana field, if you can, as you can recognize, I guess. Now, if you just leave the leaves on the ground, there is many things happening, but predominantly depending on the climate, the air, the oxygen, which is a good thing, but it works on the biomass. And the carbon, the C, reacts with the oxygen, with the O to CO2, yeah? Which is food for the trees, yes, but it's also lost to the system, because whatever goes out as gas, you need to put in back again. On the other hand, same happens with nitrogen. N, yeah, reacts with O to N2O, which is a gas, bye-bye, and you have to buy it again. You will never stop this process entirely, which is also okay, because you need some cycles. But what we want is microbial breakdown. We want to recover as much as possible of the crop residue, biomass, bound nutrients, carbons, recover most of them and bring them back to the soil in one way or the other. Yeah, we heard about, let's say, an optimal way of composting, yeah, where you collect the biomass, you make nice piles, lasagna, you turn it, you inoculate it with compost starter with microbes, you maybe even cover it. One comment though, because you didn't mention it, I hope you agree, it's good to cover it, but don't use plastic. You mentioned this semi-permeable fleece type of thing. You can use old bed sheets or just brown material, but if you use plastic, the microbes, it's like microbes are pretty similar to us. So if we put a plastic bag over our head, we would die. And same with the microbes. Just a small comment. Good. We realize that not everybody on this planet, at least today or tomorrow, maybe day after tomorrow, is able to produce compost in that way, because to collect biomass, for instance, from a tea field is extremely labor intensive, yeah, or from a cocoa plantation. So we have to look on how to stimulate this microbial breakdown, even if it's not possible through composting, but then maybe right in the field. Yeah, and this is again where microbes play a role, and I will give you an example for this. But basically, compost and soil has different roles. One role is soil organic matter and structure. So if we have a bad soil, a very sandy soil, rough structure, we apply fertilizer, but there's a lot of leakage. Yeah, up to 40% is nothing uncommon. That 40% of what you apply just is washed away. What we actually want is a soil which has a better structure, where maybe only 10%. Again, soil can be great and magic, but never 100% and perfect, so there's always going to be some leakage. But at least what you can do there is a big difference. And to show you how we try to attract specifically small farmers on this subject, I want to show you actually two 15-second videos. I hope it will work. I don't need sound because it's in Swahili anyway. Do you see something? Okay, good. So this is, as I mentioned, a project in Kenya, which we did for Tesco. Tesco is the largest supermarket chain in the UK. They sent us there because they realized the tea growers in Kenya, about 100,000, that they have a problem with I don't need sound. No. That they have problems with productivity. And then we basically did farmer field school trainings, and we did a very simple exercise. I took a handful of soil from their tea plantation, and they had a loss on yield of 30% in the last 5 years. And what I asked RISPER, the local extension officer, is to just simply pour some water into this and just watch what's happening. So what she's saying is that whatever you put into the soil, it drops out. Yeah. Still something remains, but a lot drops out. Now we did the same exercise with another piece of soil. I skipped the beginning because we don't have too much time. Should be somewhere here. This is now soil from another place. And I think you see the difference. Again, no perfect system, a few drops, but I guess the difference is clear. Much less water dropping out. This soil was actually not from the tea field, but from the small vegetable garden behind the house, where they have some crop rotation, where they grow cabbages and corn and some other stuff in rotation, where there is a lot of organic matter. So then they said, okay, where can I buy this soil? Because in the first soil, it's not really the water which drops out, but it's dollars. Yeah, because whatever drops out, you have to put in again. And in the other soil, somehow it stays. So I said, well, it's not something you have to buy, but you already have it. But we, above all, need to reproduce it, yeah, by looking at how to recover the crop residues, etc. You have in your field. So that's just as a little in between to keep you awake. Now coming back here. Yes, I had this. Now, just to repeat again, we saw this. You remember soil food web, one of the things we should remember. You have different organisms with different carbon-nitrogen ratios, and just to visualize a little bit the carbon-nitrogen ratio, each organism needs a specific carbon-nitrogen ratio to survive. And it's not scientifically exactly right, but if you say that the carbon is more the bones and the nitrogen is more muscles and other cells, then we know if we would have too much bones, we would be stiff, and if we would have too much other stuff, we would be like a jellyfish. At least we would not survive. So bacteria, protozoa, nematodes, good ones, bad ones, etc., they all have their crop-specific or organism-specific CN ratio. Now, just to pick out one thing, actually, what you presented already on the blackboard, but or whiteboard, actually, if we look at the protozoa feed on bacteria. Protozoa need, that was too fast. Protozoa need a CN ratio of 30:1. Now, I gave you already a little hint, just to check if you are still awake. Little mathematical exercise, lots of scientists in the room. If protozoa need a CN ratio of 30:1, how many bacteria do they have to eat? 6? Very good. Now, as we heard a lot today, specifically from Stephen, is that these microorganisms look quite different than us, but they're actually quite similar. Or maybe we are quite similar to them. It's about water, it's about food, it's about having fun and multiply each other, etc. But there's one significant difference. that they are less greedy. That's maybe something we can learn from them. Why? Now, as the protozoa eat 6 bacteria, they actually need a CN ratio of 30:1, but they have a temporary CN ratio of 30:6. Now, we as human beings, we would take these extra 5, put it on a bank account, and hope to get interest. But actually, the microorganisms, they release it to the soil. And this is natural fertilization. Okay, so 30:6, which is 5 nitrogen units too much, they release to the soil. This is natural fertilization. Isn't that magic? Well, it's quite, and we know only that much about soil. I am sure you know 20 times more than I do, but still, I guess there's a lot of learn. But it's really a miracle what happens, and this is billions of them, as we learned. Now, I don't believe in yes, no, good, bad, right, wrong, black, white, etc. scenarios. So there's always a combination of things. So to say, okay, you must stop chemical fertilizers or herbicides or pesticides, whatever, is easier said than done, because there is a family income depending on it, etc., etc. But still, when you plan your fertilizer applications, have one thing in mind. Remember this beauty and this intelligent way of interaction, and remember that chemical fertilizers is actually mineral salts. Ammonia nitrate is a salt. Now, what is salt doing to living organisms? Well, we have a fridge at home, but I heard from my grandmother that in earlier days they put meat into salt in order to prevent that the meat doesn't walk away after a few days, to stop life, yeah, because otherwise you have microbes, etc. Now, if you apply salt to the soil, you kill these guys. Again, it's not black, white, yes, no, right, wrong, but this is a given by the nature, and if we kind of limit it or stop it or whatever, we need to replace it somehow. So I'm sure there is a kind of healthy balance, specifically in an temporary scenario where you say, okay, we built up this, but still we can't really justify some risks in terms of yield loss, or we really need to get going, so apply a little bit of urea, DAP, or whatever. But be careful, yeah, because this is something great, and this really does great results. And we heard, and it will save you and generate you a lot of carbon. Yeah, this is, if you do this, which has a straight benefit to your system, it also gives you additional revenue streams through the carbon credits. One thing we do, we heard about liquid compost applications or the bokashi approach. What we use is, or we call it compost tea, compost extract, where we basically take microbes, activate them in a soil water mix, because compost at the end, and that's the other aspect. Some people say compost is too expensive, others say specifically the nitrogen or the nitrate is not available early enough, so you apply compost today and in 3 years you see something growing, which somehow is right, yeah, because the compost, the humus, the mature compost includes billions of microbes, but most of them are dormant because the job is done. And with this process, you can basically wake them up again. They're like human beings. If you put us in water and oxygen, we are awake pretty fast. So if we do the same thing with the microbes, with the ready-made compost, we can apply it, as you see here in the hills of Kenya. They just sprayed with a back sprayer, and we analyzed it, and they had 3 years in a row 25 to 30% higher production by applying compost, by mobilizing microbial life. There is some philosophers, but also some scientists, it's actually proven that fertilization has not much to do with nutrient input. It's more about soil life. Yeah, so the higher soil life is, the higher microbial activity in the soil, the better is your soil fertility. It's not about NPK input. That's maybe a short-term symptom treatment, but sustainable soil fertility is soil life and not input of products. Now, we did various trials where we applied this compost tea or compost extract on different products in different countries. We also, and this slide actually is missing, but we also populated a certain fungi. It's called lasso fungi or Arthrobotus, which is specifically useful to treat harmful nematodes. I could also show you something about this, but it's one of these beautiful things in soil that you have. The more diversity you have, the higher the chance that you really can naturally suppress your diseases. And this fungi basically traps nematodes, and then the nematodes get eaten by other microbes, etc. So you can do scientific trials. It's nature, yeah. So sustainable solutions are always local. It's not that what works in Australia also works in the US or Africa. So this is maybe the only effort you really have to take. Try to understand your local environment and try to see what resources you have, manure, green, brown, what are the microbes. I'm also not a friend of buying microbes from somewhere, but you basically got them on your farm normally, and then you also will see the benefit. All this, we have seen composting, we have seen kind of a nutrient improvement through compost tea, which avoids chemical fertilizers. We have seen soil structure, soil carbon build up, which results in less leakage, but also carbon sequestration. So these are different ingredients which now, actually only since half a year, are consolidated in a methodology which is published by the Gold Standard. So basically to provide potentially carbon finance to comprehensively or holistically best practice at farming level. And that's something I would like to really encourage you to do and to start pilots. Think of it. We would be happy to assist you with this, but there's also other organizations who can do that. But what I like about this approach is it's not just about harvesting money for carbon and actually become a carbon farmer, but actually stay a good farmer and first of all be a good farmer, and then capitalize on best practices and get some carbon incentives through that, because otherwise it's the wrong incentive. So be a good farmer, implement some of these practices, and there's many more, and then we can help you to translate it into carbon, to CO2 language, to make all this happen and get some extra revenues. So Soil and More, small company, 7 years old. We started it based on the demand on several growers. We do soil fertility management, we do assessments, carbon footprints, water footprints, comprehensive soil sustainability assessments. Where applicable, we also look into IT solutions to make auditing, etc., more systematic. And then, as mentioned, try to organize carbon credits through sustainable farming practices. We are a Dutch-based company, but mainly active out of Europe, outside Europe. And yeah, I would like to see as soon as possible also something happening here, and because I think there is a lot of potential. I grew up in an organic environment, but also there, I don't believe in these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. So we work with everybody, be it conventional or organic. And I can tell you that if you attend conferences about sustainability, there is enormously long debates about what sustainability means and how to measure it and whether you should include the happiness of birds or butterflies or not, and all sorts of very interesting things. But if there's one topic which everybody agrees upon and which you will find on the sustainability, actually strategic management, sourcing, purchase, whatever strategies of all the big multinationals, be it Unilever, Tesco, Nestle, whatever, number one, soil organic matter, soil fertility. Everybody agrees and says, without this, no Coca-Cola, no Pepsi, no French fries, no poultry, no nothing. You can do small projects in hydroponics, you can do things there, but let's say food security is intrinsically kind of connected to soil organic matter, to soil. If we don't care about it, no food. And that's what I wanted to share with you. There is, again, a cream on top possibility through carbon financing, which I'm happy to investigate further in the next couple of weeks or months. But it's really about becoming a good farmer, or if you are already, kind of further develop and try to link it. Because at the end, yeah, it's about our future and it's possible. Thank you.